This is John Judge. I'm sitting here on a mound in the middle of the mall in Washington, D.C. With retired Air Force Colonel Fletcher Prouty. And we're sitting actually in the same location where actor Kevin Costner and Donald Sutherland sat on a bench and portrayed in the movie JFK the characters Jim Garrison, the district attorney who tried to actually bring charges against the conspirators in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and a man identified in the film then as Mr. X, who met with Garrison in D.C. and gave him an inside story that hadn't been heard before of the intelligence community and military involvement in that assassination. And Mr. X in the film was based in large part on the work of and the history of Colonel Fletcher Prouty. Fletcher and I have known each other for about, I guess, 15 years. We first met, I don't know if you remember, when Penn Jones came in the 1970s on one of the November 22nd anniversaries out to the National Cemetery, and he made a point, I guess, to meet with you, and I happened upon that occasion to come by the hotel where he was staying and met the two of you and talked about the assassination then. I read Fletcher's book years ago, The Secret Team, which has been reprinted recently, and is an excellent history of some of the development of the CIA and covert operations and their manipulations. And his more recent book, JFK, which covers Vietnam, the history of U.S. intelligence in Vietnam. I think your original title for the book was The Saigon Solution, right. And perhaps a more pertinent title. But this particular work had appeared excerpted in magazine articles years ago, and then Fletcher did update work on it. He's written extensively. He's been published in a number of magazines and periodicals on different intelligence operations, and we wanted to try to talk today about some of them that might not have come up in other discussions. First, I thought we'd try to talk about how covert operations, at least in the modern world, I suppose there was almost always spying after civilization got to a certain point, but covert operations seem to be a next stage to spying, a sort of once you know where the next shoe is going to fall, then you in a sense cash in on it or make sure it falls in that place. And so for at least in the modern world, in the post-World War II period, or if you think during World War II is more pertinent, how do you feel the history of covert operations that are now so influential in world politics really began, and where did it begin, and who was involved? And then I thought we'd talk about the purpose of these operations.
Well, I think there's no question about it that covert operations, fun and games as they call it in the agency, really has originated in its present form after World War II. During World War II, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, was actually under the Joint Chiefs of Staff and was effectively another arm of the military doing secret, highly classified, specialized work. They're not exactly comparable. And I don't know how many people have ever noticed it, but the law that created CIA is the same law that created the present Defense Department, National Security Council, and the Army, Navy, Air Force as separate services. Well, that law nowhere mentions covert operation. It does not give the agency or anybody else the directions to get into covert operations. A lot of people don't notice that. So after World War II, there were agents and there were certain programs in denied areas, especially in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and the Soviet region, even though the Soviets had been our partners during the war, that our government realized that they should maintain those agent networks. And that was done without any law under the Office of Program Coordination, called OPC. And one of the best covert operators in the business, Frank Wisner, ran that. And it was a strange arrangement. he had to be selected by either the, nominated for the job, by either the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense, and seconded by the other one. So you see, it was an ad hoc thing that they had working, but it kept strong covert operations going, primarily in Eastern Europe.
Whose agents were these, Fletcher, that were in
well,
place?
They originally were agents of the OSS, and there were, the OSS worked with the British very, very closely. In fact, really were trained by the British, and some French agents, some Italian agents. It was a pretty good network. And the agents on through the east, out of Romania, where Frank Wisner had been during the war, a lot of people don't realize Wisner brought those Nazi agents out of Romania with a prisoner of war release in September of 1944. And that could probably be called the first step of the Cold War, because in September 1944, the Soviet army had just come into Romania. The Romanians had surrendered to the Soviets and the Allies, England and the United States. And there was a brief period while the Germans were leaving Romania and the Soviets were coming in, and Frank Wisner loaded 750 American POWs, mostly bomber pilots and crewmen, and a group of selected Nazis, intelligence experts, and their files onto a freight train, and had that freight train come from Romania through Turkey, and it goes slightly into Syria. And with the help of the British, we had been told where to go, and I was ordered by my boss, General Barnes, to fly to that place with about 35 airplanes and pick those men up. And that's when we found out that among that group were Soviet intelligence experts. So as early as that date, we were back in the covert business, so we were getting in there. Then with the agency's growth, we had certain programs before the Korean War that were clandestine operations, but the Korean War kind of kicked the thing forward into a formal basis. That's when they begin to use larger units. And as Eisenhower told the agency many times, you can't do a covert operation with more than about 3 people. Well, we tried to help the rebellion in Indonesia as one covert operation, and I can remember one day we dropped 42,000 rifles to the Indonesians. They're more than 3 people, and it wasn't covert. But covert operations evolved out of World War II and the arrival of the CIA. When Walter Beetle Smith came back, when General Smith came back from being ambassador to Moscow after World War II, he was made the head of CIA, and the first thing he did was tell President Eisenhower, who was his old boss during the war, he said, I'm taking over OPC, that's going to be part of the agency, none of this hit and miss operation that we've had. So we brought Frank Wisner and his people into the CIA, and by that time the CIA took off with covert operations, and every year it increases and increases to what we have today.
Would you say there's a model for how a covert operation works in general terms? Someone gave me an example recently. They said that Lansdale's model was create a crisis, solve the crisis, and gain control from the solution. Well,
that sounds good. I knew Lansdale, worked with him, knew him since 1953. He was a bit more sophisticated than that. First of all, a real covert operation should be small, or you can't keep it secret. But when there has to be something, like Lansdale did in the Philippines, is overthrow the president of the Philippines lawfully. You know, when Quirino was removed from the Philippines, it was not done with guns, it was done with votes. Of course, the voting structure was a little bit manipulated, but then he brought Magsaysay in, and Quirino left, and Magsaysay was president of the Philippines. And I asked Lansdale one day, what was the most effective weapon in your whole operation? And he reached in his pocket and he said, my checkbook. Because he had a checkbook, blank checks on the U.S. government, and he could buy anybody off, and that's how he ran his covert operation. Well, he did it with a lot of other things that were, for instance, people shouldn't come up with these things about another man after he's died that begin to change the truth. Lansdale was much more sophisticated than this little slogan you've heard. I've heard it recently too, and it doesn't do the man justice. In order to give Magsaysay a base among all of the people of the Philippines, Lansdale took advantage of a very small operation called the Hooks, the communists in the Philippines. And he created Hooks, and then he had other men fight the Hooks. They're the same people. After the battle during the night, they'd sit down and have breakfast together. They'd go to the next town, have another battle, and so on. And the Hook structure, the communists in the Philippines, grew to support anti-Hook movements supported Magsaysay. He was the greatest anti-Hook fighter in the world, see? And so that got him votes. And the voting by the time of the election was about 4 million for Magsaysay and 1 million for Quirino. It shows the effectiveness of Lansdale's operation. It's very sophisticated.
Well, I guess the question is, to what extent do covert operations arise as sort of ad hoc solutions to existing problems, or are they, in fact, creations for a broader plan? In other words, do you do a covert operation as a last resort, or is a covert operation one of the many tools you have in terms of manipulating a situation to go the way you want? In other words, you don't wait for a situation that's modeled to use for it, but you know, in other words, is history responded to by covert operations or driven by them?
I would say, and I worked in covert operations supporting the agency for 9 years, 55 to 64, spanned a pretty busy period of time. And I would say that my own idea and the ideas of the people I worked with in the Pentagon, meaning the senior officers, like General Lemnitzer and General White and the others, was that the covert operations were really unplanned. They were responses. If something happened in Bolivia, they responded to what happened in Bolivia. If something happened in Greece, they responded to what happened in Greece. Very rarely, and I can't think of one, were covert operations planned to bring about some special thing other than major operations which aren't covert anymore, like the Vietnam War. That was planned, and it took 15 years, took 20 years to build it up until finally it was warfare. 20 years. The first American military man died in Vietnam in September 1945. 1945. The first American troops arrived in Vietnam in March of 1965. All the intervening years were manipulated by CIA, was under the operation of CIA, and they were, you might say, making war. That was their job, but it certainly wasn't covert. So you can't quite say that covert operations and that type of action are synonymous. It's not accurate.
You mentioned the idea that keeping the operation small guarantees it being covert. In other words, that I guess the theme being that it's hard to keep a secret beyond a few people. On the other hand, we know that there was a war waged in Laos for almost 10 years with absolutely no knowledge on the part of the general American public that it was going on. Even when some of them were responding to and protesting the war in Vietnam, hardly anyone knew that the Plain of Jars was being bombed, and yet this was a full-scale military operation with armies operating, medics and planes and equipment, and didn't get out to the public. So do you feel or you take something like the Kennedy assassination, which you've done work on, do you feel it's a level on which they must be able to keep a secret, at least to some extent, even if it's a little larger than 2 or 3 people?
Well, there are grades of operation. The one in Laos is a good example, and actually the one in Laos is a very important example. There should be more accurate history written about that, because the old Burma campaign at the end of World War II, where American troops, British troops, and Chinese troops drove the Japanese out of Burma, out of Thailand, into Vietnam, and finally at the surrender, they rounded them all up in Vietnam. This brought Americans into that area, and pivotal to that was Laos. And we just continued our relationship with Southeast Asia. We never came home. Some of the same men who were in the Burma campaign are people whose names have become rather famous in the Laos campaign because they became the drug masters. They knew where the drugs were. And how did this happen? When the army in Burma was paid, the army paymasters would come in with the regular wooden footlockers and the dollar bills and pay the troops. But over here, there's some more Foot Lockers, and they'd open them up, little white packages, heroin for the Chinese troops. The U.S. Army had a source for heroin, and when the war ended, it never stopped. They continued to have a source for heroin. They moved them from South China. They were called the Mao tribesmen, or Muang, and they lived up in Laos. And so we were taking care of this large group of farmers in Laos who were growing poppies. Well, the two just got integrated, and it's not so far-fetched that the Burma campaign and the Laotian campaign were kept very quiet. But did you ever hear of what were called White Cloud teams?
No.
Well, see, the White Cloud teams were early Special Forces troops under a general, General Heinges, who took the White Cloud teams to Laos way back before Vietnam was ever in the papers. And they carried on this same business of trying to support, like in the Philippines, a government in Laos favorable to what we wanted there, and of course to replace French colonialization. And they were supposed to have arrived covertly, and they all had different names, and they didn't wear their uniforms. But in one of the strangest coincidences I've ever known of, when Colonel Heinges came in after his several hundred men had already landed, and he stepped off the command plane down to be greeted by the French army forces who actually were in charge in Laos, as he came in as an anonymous Man X type person, who should he meet but his cellmate from POW days in World War II? Blew the lid right off the whole thing, and everybody knew who he was, and everybody knew who his people were. So your covert operation went bust. We just kept going anyway. We didn't give a darn whether it was secret or not. So you can't have big ones, but there are reasons for them. And this explains, too, the unfortunate circumstance that as the Chinese divisions that were fighting in Burma moved into the Burma Triangle, and the American division moved into Laos and Vietnam, and the British actually had jurisdiction over Vietnam, but only in the Saigon area at that time, we each began to play roles which came forward during the Vietnam War days, and among them was the drug operation. It's an important point.
Well, before we go on to their overall purpose, I just wanted to ask you one more thing about covert operations. Often I see, when clipping the New York Times or the Washington Post, front page articles talking about covert operation that's going on in some country. What does it mean to have a covert operation, or what's called that, on the front page of a newspaper?
Well, on March 17th, I believe I'm correct, 1961, on the front page of the New York Times, the whole left side was a big 3 or 4 headline story of U.S. aid to the anti-Castro movement. In other words, they told all about the Bay of Pigs a month before we landed on the beach. So it wasn't covert. Castro knew about it. He used to broadcast it every night and so on. Covert is secret. And you know that once 2 people know it, you've got about 5 minutes before it's no longer a secret. I mean, let's be real. There are certain secrets. The 4 men who set up the Gary Powers U-2 flight into Russia, I believe, have never been identified, and probably never will be. The handful of men who killed Kennedy will never be identified. They never will. Those are covert. But that's a different order of battle to get up into that level. Otherwise, there are certain secret operations. One of them that became popular later is we brought the Dalai Lama out of Lhasa, out of Tibet, safely into India before the Chinese arrived, and they certainly either would have killed him or captured him. That was a successful operation, and very few people knew about it. I had the very good fortune to meet the Dalai Lama about 3 or 4 weeks ago when he was in Washington, and we talked about that escape. And he said, I never thought we were going to make it, because he said we had no food, we had no weapons. He said, but your airplanes would come over and drop what we needed, so we kept going. They were riding ponies, and the ponies needed fodder. That was the biggest thing they needed. So that one worked, and very few people know that until it was released publicly. There are operations like that are very successful. The public doesn't know about them. They're really cool.
Since covert operations that you've described include such things as providing support to what we would identify as communist forces in some instances. You mentioned the growth of the Hucks, the communist movement, being backed by Lansdale, or there are indications I know in my own work when I worked on the rise of Castro into power that, among other things, Jack Ruby, through certain CIA contacts, was apparently running guns to Castro before the overthrow of Batista, or situations where we're financing or using Nazi agents or drug runners, people that in the public rhetoric we're presumably opposed to. What are then the real purposes of covert operations if they aren't to carry out anti-drug, anti-terrorist, anti-communist activities? What was really going on? What's the purpose behind them?
Well, since you brought up the Castro movement, as you may recall, he was supported in the mountains in Cuba by CIA originally, and then they left him. Or if you want to go further back, in 1945, the 2nd of September 1945, the very day that the Japanese were signing the surrender on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo, Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of Vietnam, and on one side of him stood an Army Major General, and on the other side, an American OSS officer, and we supported Ho Chi Minh. Half of all the guns and artillery and ambulances and radios and everything that had been stockpiled on Okinawa for the invasion of Japan were moved to Hanoi and given to Ho Chi Minh. We supported Ho Chi Minh. So you get quite a few of those cases, and then a little later we supported the French, and the French were fighting Ho Chi Minh, so we were against Ho Chi Minh. Then of course we ended up the war losing to Ho Chi Minh. He was using our own weapons. So it circles back. There is no, I wouldn't know, of all the ones I know about, I wouldn't know one where I could say this is the model that every other one follows. They all sort of develop, but there is one thing they do, is they keep the military budget high. Like in Vietnam, we lost 5,000 helicopters. Just think how much that was, several $1 billion. Well, the covert action, which heated up Vietnam, caused that kind of procurement, and that's important to some people.
So would you see a direct connection? For instance, I know that Casey and Dulles and some of these others, before they got into positions in government or even in OSS, had ties to investment banking around the world, global ties, and I'm sure made profits in some instances by knowing from the intelligence that they gathered what was going to happen. Is it merely a matter of, say, the particular company that's going to make a profit off the military contracts for those helicopters setting up an operation, or is there a broader purpose of social control or political control? Are there certain type of leaders they want to bring in at all points rather than others? Or will they sort of, as a smart and rich enough man might play every horse in the race and take what they get?
Well, you mentioned the Dulles brothers as a very important point. Alan Dulles, as a young man, participated in the Paris peace conferences after World War I. In other words, he learned the business right there close up to those arrangements. And by the time of World War II, he was in the OSS, rather obviously. But in between, both he and his brother were partners of the largest law firm in the United States, probably the largest law firm in the world, Sullivan Cromwell of New York. And Sullivan Cromwell had offices all over the world, but they had a lot of offices in Germany. And when the Germans attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939, and World War II started at that time, yes, most American businesses began to close their offices in Europe, especially in Germany, and come back to the United States, not Sullivan Cromwell. And it was after Pearl Harbor, before Sullivan Cromwell brought their people back out of Germany. So when Alan Dulles went on duty to be the station chief in Switzerland and had to contact people in Germany, he was contacting the same clients he had when he was in Germany only a few months earlier, you see?
Yes.
And it makes the networks tighten up. You wonder, how does he get these agents? How does he know these people? But he didn't know agents at the field level. He knew agents at the top level, important people. And so decisions could be made regardless of what was going on in other areas. Both Dulles knew those people personally, and it's more important to be in that kind of a position than to try to fight your way in the way the armies were doing. And many of the things that happened were a result of the connections of these people that were our age. Few people realize that intelligence at the beginning of World War II was put in the hands of Vincent Astor, one of the wealthiest men in the country. Franklin Delano Roosevelt called him up, said, we need you. We don't have any intelligence organization other than services. And he became the senior intelligence director with offices in New York and other people subordinate to him. He didn't pick somebody that was a college professor or just some other activist or something. He picked one of the wealthiest men in the world.
I know that you've done a great deal of work with the question of the development of oil as a resource, a monopoly in many cases, and my understanding is that the history of oil and its corporate control also goes hand in hand with many covert and overt military and political operations around the world.
Well, oil, of course, is the predominant moneymaker in our age, but diamonds a while ago, gold at another time. It depends. It's money that runs it. I mean, follow the money, the old saying, and it's money that runs it. But oil in today's world is undoubtedly in the forefront in policy making of all kinds. Even the current situation in the Soviet Union is being highly controlled by the oil companies. It wasn't long ago, if you looked at the newspapers carefully, that you'd notice that the Soviet Union was selling 19 million barrels of oil a day. Saudi Arabia, about 6 or 7 million. Now the Soviet Union is selling between 4 and 7 million barrels a day. You see, the oil companies have moved in. They have clamped down on them. They want to keep the oil prices as high as they are. Oil in Saudi Arabia, for example, comes out of pipes that stick out of the ground. You take the cap off the pipe and the oil just bubbles up. No pumps, no nothing. It's free. It's like going to the ocean with a pail. How much you going to pay for the water? I've been told many times that in the current economic period, the price of a barrel of oil in Saudi Arabia at the wellhead is 16 cents. And that writes off everything the company has behind it in the way of costs, and 16 cents. And I guess what's the New York price today? $18 a barrel? Where does the rest of it go? That's profit. So obviously, the people who are making that kind of money and who have a market that's locked in with automobiles and trucks and shipping and railroads and everything else, airplanes, don't have to worry about, as they did in the 70s. If you don't like our price, don't buy it. So we stood out on the streets trying to find a gas station that had a few gallons left.
I guess what I'm wondering is to what extent, to say a situation where they would manipulate an election or assassinate a foreign leader or try to determine which particular group would come to power, how much of that is driven ideologically or is driven because of the geopolitical positioning of the country in relation to these resources that they own or control?
Well, my view, somewhat experienced, but personal view, I don't think there's an ideological decision ever. I think ideology is like some of these other things. It's a practical matter. The guy's in our way, let's get him. It's more like that. You can just imagine a group of businessmen in Bolivia, in La Paz, and they're saying, you know, this son of a gun that's been running this country for 6 years, he won't give us a chance. He's got his uncle on this franchise. The Ford Motor Company franchise is to his cousin. His wife's brother is here. We can't get in. There's no way we can get into. We got to get rid of that guy. We got to get rid of him. So they get rid of him, and that's not ideological. They just had to get rid of him. So I think the same applies at any level in any government. There arrived a time when they had to get rid of John F. Kennedy, and it was done for exactly the same reason. It had nothing to do with communism or world power. He was in the way of people who were in a position to be able to make that kind of a decision. So it was done. Are you riding around with his radio on?
Boombox. The current situations that we see now with U.S. intervention into Iraq, U.S. troops stationed in Somalia, and perhaps U.S. involvement soon in Bosnia. To what extent does the history of this really go back to an earlier period or connect to the history of oil?
A very interesting point, because it does have a background that is essential to an understanding of the things that came later. I was flying transport aircraft in North Africa in 1943 when the general I worked for told me to put new tires on my plane, get it all cleaned up, and go to Casablanca and pick up a geological survey team that was going on a trip, and that it was classified. I would not know exactly where we were going. I'd take my orders from the general that was in charge of the team. So I picked them up the next morning from Casablanca, and we flew to an airport near Algiers. Interesting little sidelight, that as I was preparing to land, there was a plane burning on the runway. And it was an identical plane to the kind I had, a Lockheed Lodestar, but it was a British Air Force. So they told me to land. If I wanted to land, I could land. They usually don't do that, the fire trucks and everything else. But if you want to land clear to the right and come on in. So I went landing to the right, and boom, one of my tires, brand new tire, blew. The Germans had been over the night before and dropped these nifty little devices called pyramidal knives. Three legs are always on the run, and one of them straight up. And they thought they had picked them all up, but there were thousands of them. There were some left, and one slit my tire. Well, that wasn't a good greeting to my geological survey team, but I let them realize they were in the war zone. We flew to Cairo, and after a brief meeting in Cairo, the general said, all right, tomorrow morning we'll go to Tehran. So we went to Tehran, there was another meeting there. And then the next day, he said, now we're going down to Bahrain. Bahrain is a small island off Saudi Arabian western coast, eastern coast, in the Persian Gulf. I'd been there many times, so no problem. We flew down there. That night, I met the general at the door of the plane. He wasn't in the staff car ready to drive away, and he gave me some money. He said, you and your crew go in town and buy civilian clothes. Well, we're dressed in khaki, that's all we're wearing. And he said, I want you to buy some paint and paint the insignia and numbers off the plane. No marks on your plane at all. He said, tomorrow we're going on a secret trip. I began to think where, but anyway, he was in charge. So we did that. Next morning, he said, we're going into Saudi Arabia. Those of us who were based over there used to say Saudi Arabia was violently neutral. We should stay away from it. But here we go, in. He said, what you'll find after you just cross the coast is, near the coast is a big salt flat. Somewhere on that salt flat, there will be a barrel of oil burning. And by the wind direction and where it's placed, you'll know that you have a safe ground to land on. No airports over there, we just land on the ground. So we did that. We got on the plane, we were met by 4 Americans. Those 4 Americans were from the California Standard Oil Company. One was Floyd Oeliger. Oeliger was one of the founders of Aramco, I believe the most profitable corporation that's ever been put together by mankind. And he took our geological survey team around to these various areas where they had been working and where they had discovered the fabulous Daman Dome, which is probably the greatest find of the purest oil ever found on the world. And as he took General Smith around, he'd say, General, I'll show you what we have here. And a pipe would be out of the ground, maybe 12, 15 inches high. He would unlock the lock and turn the cap off, and oil would just bubble out. And he left one of them running while we went off a few miles looking at some other ones. We came back, there was a little lake of oil there. He said, General, all you have to do is come get it. Well, the concern was that we were having a shortage of oil during the war. We needed more oil than we could get, and here was a supply, because as we started to fight Japan, and after we knew Germany was, this was end of 43, we knew Germany was getting pushed back, we would need more oil than we could get, so this was a source. So fine, I took the general down, we went to Karachi, left him there, and I had orders to fly back to Cairo. When I got back to Cairo, I was told that President Roosevelt's coming in. I didn't know that, nor did anybody. It was a secret. And President Roosevelt came in, Prime Minister Churchill came, and Chiang Kai-shek came in from China. That was the first meeting of Chiang Kai-shek with the other world leaders, raising him to world power status. And Chiang Kai-shek came with his wife, Mei Ling. Mei Ling is Mei Ling Soong, a graduate of American colleges here. Her brother, TV Soong, the wealthiest man in the world at that time. So the staff that Chiang Kai-shek had with him at the Cairo conference were not what you might call Chinese diplomats. They were the staff of Mei Ling Soong's brother, TV Soong. They were businessmen. They were there to get some things done, regardless of the war, or enough of the war so that they were going to see that China was not defeated. During this important Cairo conference, and very quietly, in fact, I don't think any newspaper reported it, Roosevelt had a meeting with my friends of the Geological Survey team and made the decision that despite wartime shortages and everything else, they would build at Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia a 50,000 barrel a day refinery immediately. And that thing was built, and it was operating before the Japanese surrendered in 1945. Really a fabulous operation. Well, that shows the significance of the availability of oil in wartime or in the rest of our economy. It hinges on that. And when we left, when the President Eisenhower left Cairo, he went to Tehran. And that morning, I was told to fly to Tehran. The Geological Survey team had gone back home. And by the way, I might say, the head of the team was General C.R. Smith, who many people will recall was the founder of American Airlines, a magnificent man. And in going to my plane the next morning for the flight to Tehran, I found my crew chief arguing with a major about some packages, great big boxes on the plane, because we were a VIP plane. We shouldn't be loaded down with somebody's cargo. And I remember the major answering to the sergeant, "Those boxes are there by order of President Roosevelt. They stay." And right away some staff cars came up, and these Chinese got out of the staff cars. They were the Chinese delegation who were there with Chiang Kai-shek. So they got in the plane, and we flew to Tehran. And about 45 minutes after takeoff, I went back to see how they were doing. They had broken open the boxes, and inside were just ordinary boxes of cornflakes. Roosevelt somehow knew that they loved cornflakes. They were sitting there with the cornflakes like you'd sit with popcorn at a movie show, just eating cornflakes out of the box, happy as can be. That showed the attention Roosevelt paid the details, and the fact that he and his family were very interested in the China trade, and he grew up in it. We arrived in Tehran. Well, first on the way out, we stopped at Habbaniyah to get some gas to complete the flight. And as we were on the ground at Habbaniyah, another airplane came in, and out of the airplane came an old friend of mine, Leon Gray, as a pilot, and right behind him, the co-pilot, was none other than Elliott Roosevelt, Roosevelt's son. And so he came over, and I introduced him to the Chinese who were with us, and got introduced to him. And he said that his father had called. He was serving as a lieutenant colonel with a reconnaissance organization in Algiers, and he was on active duty. That his father had called, wanted him to meet Stalin. Said probably be the only chance you'll ever have to meet Stalin. So Elliott was on the way up there. We took off, and they had a faster plane than we did. They got there in Tehran a little bit ahead of us. They got in the cars and went on in town, and just then we noticed the British delegation came in. They got in cars, and finally we came along, and they put us in cars, and the Chinese delegation was just ahead of me. And as we arrived in the center of Tehran, a place I knew quite well by then, the whole center of the city, like say all of this main downtown in Washington, had about a 12 or 15 foot high solid purple velvet screen around it. And you just could not get in. It was closed. And men marching with guns at the ready round and round that screen, and nobody could get into Tehran. That was the Russian idea of security. But the important thing was that just ahead of us was the British motorcade with Winston Churchill, and they weren't letting them in. And the Chinese, some of them in the car I was in, looked out really, they started laughing. We could see Winston Churchill with his ever-present cigar, and he couldn't get through. The Russians were saying, no, he was in his jumpsuit, you know, that he wore during the war, and he had no pockets, so he had no ID. And no matter whether they said he was Winston Churchill, the Russians were not going to let, at least the soldiers weren't. Finally, somebody straightened that big diplomatic problem out, and he went in, and Elliott Roosevelt went in, and the Chinese people went in. But you know, it's very interesting to note that I don't know a single history book that prints the fact that Chiang Kai-shek and his wife and this delegation were at the Tehran conference with Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill. Mm-hmm. But he was there. I flew the Chinese there, and there's no question about it. But you see, again, this is this business of controlling the news the way we want the news to come out, because much of the Tehran conference had to do with Asia, not Hitler. Hitler was defeated by that time. They made the agreement about when the invasion was going to come. That was very important. And to offset the agreement for the invasion at Normandy Beach, they wanted to get an agreement from Stalin about helping in Asia to help us defeat the Japanese. But you see, we had a strange situation. The Soviets, communists, were our partners in the war. But Chiang Kai-shek was essentially a dictator, and Mao Zedong, who was his enemy, was an ideological partner of the Soviets. And this mixed up the alliances. And we had to get Stalin to say to Mao Zedong, look, knock it off for a little while, let Chiang help the Americans and the British defeat the Japanese, and then you people settle your own problem. You know, pretty different. And again, nothing is said of that in our history book. But to show you how impressive the decision at Tehran was, you can go back into the newspaper files and you'll discover that 1 week after the invasion in Normandy, Mao Zedong, who rarely spoke to reporters and all, came out with a worldwide announcement of how pleased he was to see that the invasion had taken place and that they were winning, and he wished the forces luck and all that, and he had never said anything like that about the Allied forces before. So this took place at Tehran, as well as the decisions to fight in Korea and in Vietnam after the war. So these are but it was built on the original meeting of settling the oil decision in the Middle East. Getting that done, the other decisions went ahead. Because getting the oil out there, we couldn't have fought that war.
When the popular press said that the reason we were going into Kuwait to oppose Iraq, a dispute over basically border areas of oil, and a longer-term historical dispute over whether in fact Kuwait is historically part of Iraq and wanted to be independent or not, or to what extent that was British manipulation. The theme that was raised here, besides this aggressiveness of Saddam Hussein, was that we were dependent in the United States on the oil coming from Kuwait. Whereas, in my view, I wondered whether the amount of oil necessary to take all those planes and ships over there wasn't, in fact, probably a large percentage of the oil that would have been available to us in Kuwait. I've read something saying that the military currently consumes over 60% of the energy pie net in the United States, and a large percentage of the oil is consumed by the military. And I wonder to what extent it's credible that we're actually involving ourselves in wars where we're fighting to control the oil that's necessary to run the war that we're going into.
That's an awfully good point, because not enough is said about it, not enough is studied about it. You can have oil, all the oil you want, like I described that oil in Saudi Arabia, but if you can't transport it, it's worthless. And when we had in 1973 this so-called oil crisis, the energy embargo, the Arab oil embargo, or whatever you want to call it, when we had that problem and we couldn't get gasoline at the pumps, you know what really happened? And we haven't thought it through. The Arabs don't embargo oil. It's their only cash crop. They want to get it out. But what was controlled was the super tankers did not come in to the Persian Gulf. And then you want to say, well, how is it that the super tankers become that important? Because there's pipelines in the Middle East. The Middle East is covered with pipelines. But now let's go back in history and see what happened. What's happening right today? The pipeline, when I flew to Habanea, going to the Tehran conference, I followed pipelines that went to Habanea, across the desert to Iraq. Those pipelines were closed in 1948 as a function of the Arab-Israeli war at the time Israel was being established. They go from the Mosul fields, the Kirkuk fields of Iraq to Haifa in Israel. They're dry. They've never been opened, so you can't get oil out that way. As an alternative, the Iraqis built pipelines to the Tripoli area in northern Lebanon and going through Syria. And for years they carried oil through that exit. During the war of 74, 75 back in there, those pipelines were closed, so they can't get oil out that way. Of course, the obvious way for the Iraqis to get oil out would be down the Tigris-Euphrates River and into the Persian Gulf, but that was closed to them by Iranians or by Kuwaitis, and they don't use that. That base that Kuwait took over that they were fighting for was the oil outlet for the Iraqis to get oil into the market. And one of the most surprising things is that the largest pipeline in the world, the one from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia that joins, called TAP line, the highest volume pipeline system in the world that goes from Saudi Arabia to Kuwait, goes to Sidon in Lebanon. The first city attacked a few years ago, when the attack was made on Lebanon, was the city of Sidon. And it was closed down, and oil cannot flow through there. When you begin to study that pattern and realize that these countries in the Middle East have got the oil but can't move it, then you have to go to the next step. And in 1982, I was invited to the annual meeting of the Chartered Institute of Transport, which is held in London. And at the Chartered Institute of Transport meeting, I listened to a man who owns one of the largest consortium of supertankers in the world tell his international audience of a very small group that were all interested in transport of oil, as I was, that it was the ships that stayed outside the Persian Gulf and would not carry the oil until the bidding had gone up to $7.40 a barrel. When it reached that level, the ships went in to pick up the oil. Then finally it went up into the $14 area, and they kept going. And as you know, during that energy period, it went as high as $35 and $40. Well, it is that kind of leverage applied by the shipping consortium and their bankers, and not the Arabs, that controls what oil flows. So when Iraq fought Kuwait for this opening into the Persian Gulf, which Kuwait had taken over, they were fighting for some way to get oil out. It's not a inter-Arab problem, Muslim differences and all that. It's a practical problem. They sit on one of the biggest supplies of oil in the world, and they can't get it out.
Well, I also understood that the Kuwaitis had been, especially during the Iran-Iraq War, pushing the limits of their borders further and further north into the southern portion of the Rumaiyah oil fields in Iraq, and that they had actually bought out an American oil company that had developed a slant drilling technique, that rather than drilling down into the earth, they would drill across, and that they were able by that to actually drill into the Rumaiyah oil fields across the border and pump out tens of billions of gallons of oil without paying for it and without any reparations, and that was part of what was motivating the situation.
Well, the big deal for Kuwait is to serve as a hub in the transportation net, because the oil ports of Iran, the oil ports of Iraq, Kuwait's own oil ports, and to a degree the Saudi port, when you're talking about the tap line oil, they control the movement of oil in the Middle East. And Kuwait is there like a plug on the top of the bottle to keep anything out of it they want. It's the control of the transport of oil where the big decisions are made and where the big influence is made. OPEC doesn't. It's in the transport area, and when they want to block that for various reasons, that's when the price of oil goes up or goes down. Oil should sell like it used to. I can remember when I first bought a car, gasoline at the pump was between 8 and 10 cents a gallon. It ought to be there. It doesn't cost anything to take it out of the ground.
The positioning also in that region of the northern portion of Somalia, which is essentially right across the channel of where this oil would be coming down, seems to make it, along with the large deposits of oil in Somalia itself, seems to make it a critical military location also. And the idea that U.S. troops are there merely because they're concerned about the Somalis starving to death, it wasn't a matter that seemed to concern them for the first 3.5 years of the hunger crisis there.
You, of course, understand that had a lot to do with the Vietnam War. There's enormous quantities of oil in Vietnam. But an interesting factor is, during the so-called energy crisis, right over here on 18th and K Street, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where Henry Kissinger and a lot of his friends are prominent, operated a Federal Staff Energy Seminar. The object of the Federal Staff Energy Seminar was to indoctrinate the makers and movers of Washington. In other words, the administrative assistants of senators and congressmen, second level, third level, first and second level people in the departments, on what the story is about oil and how to tell it and what they should know about it. And that seminar, with meetings every month, ran for 4 years during the 70s. And the people that they rotated through there to speak to the members of the seminar were, I remember one day I was there, by the way, representing American Railroad, because our offices were here in Washington, so I sat for the railroads, and others were there for that similar purpose. But you'd see Henry Kissinger there, you'd see Jim Schlesinger there, you'd see people, because this was the word on oil. It's very important to establish that and to get the thought uniform. So when you try to say that one oil company or one other idea impinges over the others, we forget a major geological problem. One of the key speakers one day at this seminar was a fellow named Kantrowitz. And as he was speaking, he said he thought everybody there should know that if all the oil wells ever drilled by man in all time had been drilled at random, we would have as much oil as we have with the so-called scientific drilling techniques. What he was saying is that oil is really almost everywhere. And one of the most, we'll let the airplanes fly here for a minute. We can't put up with their takeoff. But this is a real key material. One of the most interesting things about the control of petroleum and us through that leverage is what petroleum is anyway. What's its origin? In 1892, in Switzerland, there was a scientific meeting at which a number of men from all over the world created the definition of organic matter. Now, organic matter is leaves and watermelons and squirrels and us. Anything hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen is organic matter if it was living. Well, oil is called to be the product of organic matter, the decomposition of organic material over time. Absolutely contrived fallacy, and yet it is taught in every book in the world. So that we call oil a fossil fuel. It's absolutely not a fossil fuel. In fact, in their eagerness now to use these wonderful drills you're talking about, they go down as deep today as maybe 30,000 feet for oil. There has never been a fossil of anything found below 16,000 feet. So what do we call an oil fossil fuel for? Let's face up to the issue. The idea that oil is limited to the amount that could be gotten from decomposed, formerly living matter, most people think, gee, the last barrel of oil will be used up by the year 2000. Or the last barrel of oil is only, 40 years away. Utterly ridiculous. Oil is the second most available liquid next to water. And any real, honest scientist or geologist will tell you that. This fossil fuel business is part of the whole game. You begin with education, and then you take over a situation, and we have what we have with the oil situation, or the nuclear situation. The oil people were first to realize that their real opponent was going to be nuclear energy. They said that the trouble with nuclear energy is that it is so cheap that they won't put meters in the houses. They'll just send a check like cable TV. Use all you want and just send us $15 a month. And that's the truth. There's no reason why nuclear... When I went to Antarctica, in this little bit we had in the movie there with Oliver Stone, when I was sent to Antarctica, the reason was to install a nuclear plant there. This was the U.S. Navy putting a little tiny nuclear plant in Antarctica. It ran for 10 years, from November of 63 until November of 73. And why did they take it out in 73? So people couldn't say, what do you mean we can't use nuclear in place of this petroleum that you think is going to run out? This is doing great. They didn't want to be able to show. They destroyed something that was running perfectly. So the real enemy or danger to the oil companies is nuclear power. And that's all like creating the fantasy that it is an organic substance, so we think that it's short-lived. This business today of saying that nuclear power is dangerous and all that foolishness. We're sitting out here, or we were, in the sunshine. That's radiation. And nuclear power ran for 10 years. The Navy ran it with one man on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 10 years. And the plant was running at prime when they broke it down and took it away. So, and that's done to satisfy the oil people.
Well, I felt especially with the Saudi Arabian and Middle East oil, but even back to the time of World War II, development of oil and its movement around the world, that the situation had less to do with any real shortage that we were experiencing or any real dependency that the United States had on access to that oil, and had more to do with the manipulation that made sure that other people didn't have access to that oil. Specifically Japan and Germany, that don't seem to have any internal oil source, and that to this day they've been sort of artificially manipulating the situation out of Saudi Arabia, so that there can't be, as you say, any direct pipeline into Europe or these other places where where the oil could be made more cheap or available.
You see, under the system that was originally planned, and it was quite efficient, there is in Europe a Euronet of oil pipelines. So that if you can get the oil, I believe, to Marseille, I think that's where it is, then you just pump oil all over the place. And of course, despite what the popular idea is, we helped the Russians create major oil pipelines out of Russia. So they were supplying most of Russia's fuel and also the natural gas support. There's unlimited natural gas in Algeria, just across the Mediterranean. There are no shortages. The shortage is in distribution. And even there, a country like Japan is simply hard-headed enough to know that the way out is nuclear, although they're very sensitive about it being accused of developing nuclear. If you recall, about, was it five or 6 months ago, they brought this shipment of plutonium to Japan, and they got it from France and brought it to Japan. Well, that probably by now is beginning to run a huge breeder reactor, which will be perpetual in its operation. And a breeder reactor will desalinate ocean water so they've got all the water they'll ever want. But more importantly, it will break ocean water into its elementary atomic substances, hydrogen, and hydrogen will be piped throughout all of Japan as the basic fuel. Every time, just like natural gas, you turn your stove on, hydrogen will be burned. Any physicist can tell you that hydrogen has a specific impulse 3 times as great as any other normal fuel except a nuclear fuel. So the Japanese are just bypassing petroleum and coal and going directly to the answer to their problem, and they'll turn the whole country onto a hydrogen economy, which you might almost say they'll hardly be worth trying to pay for because it will be so cheap, and they'll get all the water they want at the same time.
Incident happens, it looks to me like a covert operation. I try to go back into the backgrounds of the individuals involved and do work on their biographies and that of their families, because it appears to me over time that certain people seem to filter in and out of these operations. One example of that would be Oliver North, when he first sort of appeared in the public eye, and I began to look into his family background. I found that his father was a quartermaster and a right hand to General Lucius Clay in the years 46 to 48 in Germany, which were central, among other things, to the pardoning, well, I guess they didn't pardon him at that point, but concealment and movement of the Nazi war criminals that they were connected with. As an instance, another person that I looked into was General Schwarzkopf, who was so central to the war in Iraq, and both he and his father were graduates of West Point, as was Oliver North's father, and Schwarzkopf's father was a soldier in World War I. Afterwards, he was the head of the New Jersey State Police. He was known for running the police State Police in New Jersey as a sort of paramilitary operation, a tight ship. And he was the one person in the police department most central in the, I believe, framing of Bruno Hauptmann in the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's baby. He was a propagandist for the emergence of a growing police presence in the society. He was the radio announcer in the 1930s for the Gangbusters show, which was developed out into almost all media now as cop shows, whether they're in outer space or at home, which are to promote the need for and the reliability of and the benignness of police and military operations. And later on, after the end of World War II, he was commissioned back in as an officer in World War II. He was stationed over in Saudi Arabia in that period. One of the jobs that he had, as you mentioned in your history, this huge oil refinery that was built there for the Dolman Dome. At one point, American troops went in to guard that, about 30,000, and he was the officer that was sent to run that operation. At the end of the war, he was also sent back into to Germany, and he worked closely with elements in Germany that were getting the key Nazis out. After the war in 1951 and again in 1953, he worked with Kermit Roosevelt and Jack Odell, agents of the Central Intelligence Agency, who were involved in manipulations in the elections in Iran when they felt that Iranian oil was going to be nationalized, and they took a popularly elected leader, Mossadegh, overthrew him and put in the Shah of Iran and made sure that what had been British control of petroleum there went to American sources. And then we see his son rise, first in Vietnam and then to national prominence, now to the level that they talk about him whether he wants it or not as a presidential candidate. So it seemed to me that certain people or certain families sort of, through their training or they're chosen somehow, they filter in and out of all these various operations through time, and that you can find those sort of familial or organizational relations going back. And I wonder to what extent in your work and your experience you feel that there are certain sort of operators that will show up because of their expertise and less because of the situation that happens to be called for.
Well, you cited some very good examples. In my own work, which generally was limited to supporting CIA, in order to increase the number of military people available to the CIA and to increase people that had the skills and the awareness of that kind of work, special weapons work and so on, and I don't mean nuclear weapons, but unusual weapons and all that kind of thing, the Army agreed to increase the training of the Special Forces troops. Well, the man that did it was Lansdale. See, he's ideal because Lansdale had been doing all this work in the Philippines and had been with the CIA all through those years and probably was as much an expert in that area, and he knew the people to know and that sort of thing. So one day, Lansdale, myself, and a major at the time, Sam Wilson, flew a plane to Georgia to the Army School for Civil Affairs and Military Government, which is a very interesting operation. It goes on beyond that, but the scope of it is that when you take over an area that has been devastated by nuclear weapons and things, and just plain general warfare, it needs some kind of government to start over again. And we trained military troops and was very successful in Italy during World War II. But the idea could expand into other things, into covert operations. So the school at Fort Gordon, Georgia, was the nebulous of all this thing, and Lansdale knew that, so he went down, and we took a copy of their basic curriculum, a big book like that, and on the way back, I was flying a plane, and Ed came up, and he said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to break this book into 3 parts, and I'll write this part, you do this, and Sam will do that, and we worked on it, and we created the new Special Forces curriculum, the Green Beret curriculum. The Special Forces had an entirely different mission in the old days, and started it down at Fort Bragg. And this became then adjunct to CIA, so they could always call on these people along with them. By the way, that was not the Kennedy Center down there. This was done in the Eisenhower era. In fact, the man that dedicated that center was Deputy Secretary of Defense Jim Douglas, and although for some reason they call that the Kennedy Center, that's a misnomer. But what we did is get people trained in these things, and then General May and the Air Force thought, well, the Air Force ought to have people like that, so we started the Air Commandos, and then on beyond the Air Commandos, the Navy had the SEAL teams, and so we all were in this business of being able to do undercover work that would support the operation of the agency. Well, North was in that, Secord was in that, General Adderholt was in that. Adderholt worked for me. They all worked under I was the top man of the JCS, so naturally they all worked through the system. But as you have noted, they all have had experience. Now another thing is then, how were they selected? Well, you go back one step to what you were talking about. North's father was a man that people knew, and they go, well, he'll be a good man. Schwarzkopf's father was a people, you know, it goes that way. Well, it goes even further than that. You've heard of the Trilateral Commission. Okay, what does the Trilateral Commission really do? Run by David Rockefeller, among others. It opens doors. If you've got a brilliant young man working here in the Pentagon, and you think he ought to get into this kind of work, some special job here or there, they make him a member of the Trilateral Commission. They give him briefings and who to meet, what banker to know, who to know in Germany, who to know over in Tokyo, and that sort of thing. Next thing you know, he's a very effective person. Jimmy Carter, the name. Clinton name. They come out because the doors are open for them by these other people or by their families, like the Dulles family. So that's integral to all of this operation, especially when it is to be done covertly. And you have to have secrets in government. So it brings in people, as you say, like the Schwarzkopfs and the Norths and so on, that seem to have a family affinity, as the Dulles brothers did, you see. It's just a natural way of getting things done, especially when you don't want somebody else to know what they're doing.
I think
did you know, for this is fun, but did you know that during the 60s, the man that came out with the Pentagon Papers, Les Gelb, the man that put the Pentagon Papers on the door of the New York Times, Dan Ellsberg, worked in the same offices. Yeah. Not at the same time, but in the same offices. So did Bill Bundy, George Bundy's brother. The whole group was in the same office. As a result, then they could work like their own little special forces organization because the Eagleburger was in the same office. I've got the telephone books. You open up the telephone books to International Security Affairs, and here's all these names. You know, well, a lot of people wonder, you know, well, where did this man start from? Where did he get his experience? It's from association. Sometimes just nothing more than the Ivy League, but it comes from association.
Well, I find it's hard to develop those associations in many cases. Not impossible, but the research has to be done. In fact, the first section I generally read in any newspaper is the obituary, especially here in D.C., because often they don't tell you who somebody was and who they knew until they sum it up at the time of their death. And then you can begin to, you know, to piece together, whereas the who's who might change from year to year what they say about a person or what connections that they would give you. But I've always felt that there were those kind of family ties, where they went to school, what particular organization like Skull and Bones at Yale that they might have been tapped into, and that these people then become sort of reliable elements that can be identified.
Well, you know, I taught at Yale for 3 years right after World War II. And I could just run off the names. I mean, after all, Bush was one of the students there. He wasn't in my class. Bill Buckley was there. Yes. And you can run right down the list. And a lot of the people I met in CIA were students of mine at Yale. Met them 20, 30 years later. But you're right. That's where the relationships grow. And then they feed into these outfits like the Council for Foreign Relations and so on. And overall, they aren't sinister organizations, but like a good harp, they're played on a lot, you know. And that's where the people come from that get those jobs. Or their associates, somebody from Skull and Bones, well, he was a real fine guy, we'll pull him into this operation.
Yes. It would seem that these kind of operations couldn't go as far as assassinating a world leader, for instance, or especially as far as assassinating a president here in the United States, without some autonomy, either as a whole or in part, from the executive branch. And I wondered to what extent your experience were the operations that you were involved in under any effective congressional oversight. To what extent would they have been known to the executive office or initiated from there or not, or to what extent could they have operated independently enough to do things that the president really didn't want done?
John, you've hit on, I think, from all of my experience, one of the most important questions of the whole afternoon. is the oversight, because it was my duty. I mean, I'm a military officer, and I have to do what I'm told to do. Generals would tell me to go to Capitol Hill and to talk to Senator so-and-so and Senator so-and-so, this man in the House, and so on. They had a list. Talk to them and let them know what we're going to do, a covert operation. And they were limited. There were people we could go to. There were people we couldn't say a word to. I have gone, over the 9 years I was in that work, I couldn't tell you how many hundreds of times, not to hundreds of people because it was a very select list, but to the same individuals, and to sometimes they broaden it to another man and so on. And I hate to say this, but the general response I got when they saw me coming in the door was, well, Colonel, how are things going today? Did the Red Sox win yesterday? Well, I haven't looked at the paper yet, John. Well, what about, they keep on, so one of them knew my father. Every time I show up, they always talk about my father. The other side of it was, and he told me this bluntly, he said, what I don't know won't hurt me. And he wouldn't listen to me. And most of them, in one way or another, would not let me tell them what the general had sent me there to tell them. So I go back to the general and I say, well, I appeared, I tried to talk to them. I must tell you honestly that I did not get to talk to them, so you'll know that we did what we're supposed to do. We got there. It is a shame. It is terrible, because those same men vote the money. They've just voted $28 million, $1 billion for the CIA this year. And I don't think they have any idea, other than for a few salaries, where that money's going. And this is where it breaks down, because I'm not saying we shouldn't have some of these operations, covert operations, or the best intelligence in the world, but my goodness, it ought to be under somebody's control. There ought to be accountability. And that really is an awfully important question, because I can tell you, I went there I have been sent to Senator Kennedy's office when Kennedy was a senator, and get a very mild response to the fact that I wanted to talk to him. Now, I only named Kennedy because it was once or twice, but others were regularly. So it's a very important subject. That's where the money comes from.
Yes. I know that you've studied and investigated covert operations, both while you were ones that happened while you were in the military and in this position of coordinating covert support from the Pentagon, and since. And I wanted to talk to you about some specific examples of covert operations that would fall into the line of maintaining or even increasing the Cold War hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union. And two examples that come to mind, you may want to bring up others, are the flight of the U-2 and Francis Gary Powers, and later the downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007, right at a point, in both cases, at points when we were nearing détente.
The U-2 was very crucial in our history, and it's amazing that people, I don't quite know how to say this, that people research or study or read and don't know anything about it, or they don't bother doing it either. The congressional record for May of 1960, you know the U-2 went down on the 1st of May 1960, so the congressional record for May of 1960 contains the hearings of the Fulbright Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, during which hearings they listened to Alan Dulles and others, Mr. Bissell and so on, talk about the U-2 operation. Alan Dulles, on more than one occasion during those long sessions, said clearly the U-2 was not shot down from its operating altitude. Now, if you tried to go to the Washington Post today or the New York Times or anybody that I know of and say, will you please print as a headline or a little headline on page 25 back there, just say the U-2 was not shot down by the Russians, they won't do it. Even if you talk to the Russians, now that they're all purified and you can go over and listen to them because they're going to tell sonnets, the first thing they say is, well, at least we had the ability to shoot down your U-2.
Yeah.
You know, first of all, the U-2 at its operating altitude, which is much higher than has ever been released, was operating with a trace of hydrogen into its fuel to sustain combustion in the engine. You couldn't take these ordinary airplanes up to that altitude. And the plane was highly pressurized because there's no pressure up there to keep the pilot alive. It's pressurized. If that airplane had been touched by any kind of a weapon, including a sparrow, you know, it would have burst like a balloon, powers would have gone miles away, and the plane would have gone some more miles, we never would have found the parts. As it is, in General Eisenhower's own book, he writes about Powers landing the plane on its belly, which is customary. It didn't have wheels, and not like a conventional plane. And what else do people need for the proof? Powers stepped out of the wreckage. You know, you have seen pictures of the escape and evasion things, among them the pill, the needle with the poison in it.
Yes.
Well, did you read the fine print where the Russians found those things? If he'd been blown out of the plane and he used his parachute, they'd have been all over the countryside. They were in the seat of his parachute. He had never opened his parachute. Well, isn't that clear enough to people? So the U-2 was not shot down. And Allen Dulles said that. Eisenhower said that. It's in the record. Anybody can get the congressional record and read it. I had papers that were issued before it became public, but it's public now. And so why did it come down, see? Well, just at that time, Eisenhower and Khrushchev had a pretty good understanding. You know, meeting at Camp David, Khrushchev had traveled around, went out in the cornfields of Kansas and all that sort of thing. And Khrushchev, as he left Washington, said, now, I want to invite you to Moscow on this crusade of peace that we're both working on. So there was an invitation to Eisenhower to visit Moscow, I think in June of 1960. And furthermore, they were going to have a summit conference in Paris in May of 1960. The U-2 destroyed the summit conference and reignited all the anti-communist feelings, completely abolished the idea of Eisenhower going to Moscow for the meeting over there, and we began the cycle that brought us into the biggest defense budget we ever had, because of the hostility that it arose again on the Soviet side to think that we would fly a plane over there like that at such a time. I mean, that seemed to be exactly, that's what hurt Khrushchev more than anything. He said, gee, my friend Eisenhower is setting up these meetings with me, and then he has this plane go. And in the first announcements that Eisenhower made about that flight, if you'll recall, he read some stupid cover story that had to do with NASA about upper air thing, and the poor old pilot drifted off course. Later, he had to admit that it was a flight, and of course, the thing that was very important here was that the U-2 plane was a Lockheed U-2 that had crashed in Japan, right on the outskirts of Atsugi Base, where Oswald was, by the way. Had been rebuilt. It wasn't damaged. Rebuilt by Lockheed, and presumably once rebuilt for this special mission, because the real secret of the U-2 was what technicians know as the Lundahl camera, a camera without equal. It's what did all the fantastic photography from U-2s. The one that Gary Powers went down with did not have a Lundahl camera. It had just a plain old everyday camera. So we didn't, whoever planned the flight and
knew that it would go down.
Powers go down,
yes,
knew that they didn't want to give away that valuable camera. Yeah, pretty careful thinking, wasn't it?
Yes.
There's a lot more story about that. The U-2 was very pivotal in our history because things changed. Nixon wasn't elected. Kennedy was elected. It changed our history right along through.
Well, I know Powers, when he was exchanged later for one of the captured Soviet spies, Abel, was it, I think?
Yeah.
And he came back to the United States, wrote a book, Operation Overflight, and in that book, he intimates that he felt that the plane might have been brought down by the Soviets because the radar secrets would have possibly been compromised by Oswald, who was in a position to know these things. But later in his life, when he worked in Los Angeles for air traffic control for one of the local TV stations there, he said in a television interview, in I guess it was the 1970s, late 70s, that he now felt, at least at that time, that the plane had been sabotaged in some way, and that the United States was responsible for bringing it down.
Very simple before you get off the subject, John, because it's technical. Remember I told you it had to have hydrogen go through with the regular jet fuel? What they did is they only put about half a bottle of hydrogen, and the hydrogen is in a bottle like a fire extinguisher bottle that is put in. In fact, my offices, the supply function that I ran, was the agency to supply the hydrogen, and my men even told me that they weren't quite sure of that bottle where it came from. and the thing ran out halfway, so the engine failed at the high altitude. If he could have restarted at 20,000 feet, he could have gone for the rest of the distance. But by the time he got down to 20,000 feet, there were MiGs flying around him, and so he landed. But that's important. See, it was sabotage, and I believe by the lack of hydrogen, because it would never show up. You see, people would think, well, he used the fuel anyways. And at first, a lot of people used to say that I was wrong when I wrote that, but even the Lockheed people now have admitted that hydrogen was probably the problem.
I thought it was suspicious also that 2 weeks after this television interview, it was the first time that Powers questioned the official story. His own helicopter was involved in a mid-air explosion and crashed.
Ran out of fuel.
Yeah.
His own plane ran out of fuel. Same trick twice.
No.
He should have quit flying. No, but you see, that's the old story that once the operation goes, it gets repetitive. It worked once, we'll do it again, we'll do it again. And I won't say that's what happened in Los Angeles, but you can see that there's a tendency for things like that to recur.
Years later then, as the United States was approaching a new period of détente, of arms limitations, of getting rid of chemical and biological weapons, research, of cutting the defense budget by as much of a third. These were the kind of bills that were in Congress in the week that this incident happened involving the Korean airliner, passenger airliner KL-07, and almost immediately the United Nations was regaled with this story of the brutal Soviet empire, that they had no concern for human life, as we'd always known, and the report basically organized by Oliver North and Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was then the ambassador to the United Nations. Tapes were played, and it led to a complete reversal then during the Reagan years, right at that point, of any real moves toward détente. And I know that you did extensive work on the 07 flight, and that your feeling is not the official story that this was a commercial plane that, for whatever purposes, off course or spying, went into the Soviet airspace and was intercepted and shot down. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
I'm one of these guys that likes to take a shortwave radio and just go around the band at night and listen. And just by coincidence, fortified by the next day's papers, but I will put it this way because it actually happened this way, just by coincidence, I heard a shortwave station say that a Korean airliner had last been heard from about half an hour ago, and that the air traffic control system was putting out search warnings to try to find where the plane went. I heard that. That was just a little announcement. About 30 minutes later, I heard another very interesting thing over the radio that I think is the key to the whole Korean 007 incident. It was announced on shortwave radio, and it was on the front page of the New York Times the next morning. So whether you want to believe the radio or the New York Times or other papers, here's what it said. That a CIA message sent to the Foreign Ministry of Korea and to other addressees, including Japan and, of course, our own country, among others, and I think even to Moscow, the CIA message said that the missing Korean airplane had landed safely on Sakhalin. Now, that was a CIA message. Now, why was that CIA message sent at that time? When the Japanese air traffic control people heard through their own radars and their own system that this plane had not called in, and their radar showed it descending for about 6 minutes, which is about right from 35,000 to the losing it over the horizon where they were, immediately launched air-sea rescue ships out into the ocean, 12 of them, to go out and find the wreckage of the airplane. It was the CIA message that the Japanese got that caused them to call their ships and say, the plane's safe on Sakhalin, come back, fellas, we don't get any problems, see? And so they call a ship that. Very clever, because as a result, the wreckage, despite what people say, has never been found. It's out there south of Hokkaido. By the way, one of the deepest ocean trenches in the world. The Kuril Trench is right there. And if you want to find 007, you go down in that trench. There was a third message later that a vice president of the Korean airline had just left Seoul, Korea, to go to Tokyo to be joined by the Japanese because Korea does not have diplomatic relation with the Soviet Union. And he was going to go to Sakhalin and arrange for the release of the passengers and the airplane and the crew. Well, those 3 messages tell you the whole story. And the next morning, when I got up to go to work, I was working right over here at Roslyn, which is a couple of miles from us, and I was working across the street from the building that produced the USA Today paper. I picked up the USA Today and the New York Times, both, because I knew there'd be plenty of stories. So I went up to my office to read it, and these messages that I tell you were there. By that time, though, things had grown a bit. Like, something that was very important, I think, was that the CIA message, when it arrived in the State Department at about 9:30 at night on August 31st, we're on the other side of the date line here, was delivered to the duty officer, and the duty officer immediately told the secretary to call Congressman McDonald's family in Georgia to announce that no matter what they heard about the plane, it was safe and sound. Now, I cannot imagine any government employee who was going to call somebody's family and say, look, don't worry, everything's all right, if he thought it was a lie. In other words, they believed that CIA message. Now, have you noticed there has never been a word of that CIA message except that first day? See? Which is pretty interesting. Even by the State Department or by any of the I wrote to the, I know 1 or 2 of the people in the New York Times pretty well. I wrote to the New York Times once and I said, look, let's do us a favor. Reprint from your front page the 007 news, and then print a little story, editorial if you wish, about the significance of why you printed and how you printed that news, which is so different from the story that everybody thinks. But you printed it. And I never got an answer from him, you see?
Not to that one.
We can go a lot further into this because there were a lot of other interesting things happen at that time. Well, one I think is important. Jean Kirkpatrick was the ambassador to the UN at the time. And somebody supplied her with a whole bunch of information about the conversation that was intercepted of the Russian fighter pilots that went up to shoot the plane down. Well, I found that on the next day's newspaper, taking up about a page and a half. You know, it's a voluminous account of this pilot going this way and this one that way, and he got so much fuel, and who sees what and what's going on. Just guys talking to each other, the way the pilots would be doing in such a pursuit mission. Well, I covered my table with a big piece of brown wrapping paper, and I began from the base where they took off, and I tried to make the course where those planes went. I'm a pilot. I know that. I'm a founder of the International Air Traffic Controllers Association. I'm very clear. Secretary McNamara put me in the job of helping to found that association. I'm a former manager of Tokyo International Airport, and I'm a jet pilot myself. In other words, I understand the business. So I drew it all out on the paper. You know those lines never meet. Sometimes a report of one plane, number 12, will say, had 4,000 gallons. The next time 12 called in, he had 6,000 gallons. Another time some other guy calls in, I got 20 gallons, I got to land. The next time he calls in, he got 400 gallons. You know, it was so confused and contrived that right there you could say this whole thing had to be planned. They couldn't even invent those crazy tapes without some period of time. But you can't get anybody to listen to you when you're... The whole darn thing is a contrived operation that they just foisted on the public because we have no way to get responses from the media. The media is all one direction. No way I can make my report, although I did publish many articles about the U-2. I mean, the 007, you can't get the media to touch it.
Well, I know McDonald in Anchorage, which was the crossover point, you know, the planes served as a hub on the flight because the planes flew out of the United States into Anchorage and then went down and switched planes, I think, or at least stayed on the same plane, but got off the plane and got back on. And McDonald...
No, he was asleep on the plane. When they went on the plane, he was asleep.
Okay.
I know it was... You're thinking about Jesse Helms. Jesse Helms and Senator Sims swapped their plane. They got on 015. 015,
and
yes. McDonald stayed on 007. I'm not trying to controvert what you say, but I'm quite sure it went that way. That O'Donnell, when they, you know, just a fuel stop, O'Donnell was asleep, and so they left him alone. But Helms and Sims got on 015 that had started in Los Angeles, where 007 had started in New York.
Okay, well, there
doesn't make much difference, but it meant that Sims and Helms were not on that.
Not on the plane, yes. Well, I know that there were about 6 or 7 passengers on the manifest that got off and didn't take that plane. I mean, and you know, and presumably McDonald stayed on it. I felt that part of the cover story, the Safe on Sakhalin, might have been a way in order to go a different direction if certain details didn't work out in the story, or they had another possible propaganda purpose besides the short term of calming everybody down and not getting them to look in the right place, which was that you would develop a story that MacDonald, who was a far right-wing Congress member who, you know, with the John Birch Society, an anti-communist and a propagandist for that point of view, and one of the leading members in the John Birch Society, would be captured. In other words, taken into the so-called Soviet Gulag, and an issue could be made, or a bargaining chip of some kind, that he come out of there. And that's what I thought was originally part of the purpose of that story. I was living in D.C. at the time, and friends of mine worked across the street down here on Massachusetts Avenue from the Heritage Foundation building. They went into work that morning. At that point, when they were going into work, the only news would have been that a Korean airliner, is in trouble. The Sakhalin story might have been out that early, but not likely.
I bought the New York Times that was printed in New York City.
Yes.
In other words,
All right.
early one, you know. And then I bought one here in Washington.
Okay.
And I kept both of them because you have to watch the time difference with them. But the CIA message that the plane was safe on Sakhalin is in all of them.
Okay.
And I went
From the
to the
earliest
Library of
reports.
Congress to check the message around the world. And I've got a whole sheet of listings around the world, so that the message wasn't contorted. It went around the world, and I heard it on radio anyway, so it was on. I know it was on shortwave.
Okay.
And
well, the reason I'm bringing it up is that early in the morning, regardless of whether they got the Sakhalin message or not, the significance of that flight, or who was on that flight, would not have been known to the general public. And what they found in the gutter outside the Heritage Foundation building were a couple of bumper stickers that somebody apparently had dropped off of a load on the way in. And they picked them up just because of curiosity and what's over here at the Heritage Foundation, and later gave me one of them. And this bumper sticker was printed by the Richard Viguerie Foundation, a right-wing funding arm, and the slogan was, "Remember Larry McDonald in Flight 007." That early in the morning on the day of the event. So I felt that the people around McDonald who knew the significance, also American Opinion, the Birch Society magazine, as recently as 2 years ago, was carrying on the story of the Sakhalin landing and the idea that McDonald is really still alive, which was my thinking, that this might be dragged back out at a later point in order to bring McDonald back. But there were many things going on around McDonald at that time that I felt was important to either kill him or get him out of the picture, out of the congressional spotlight. And the major one, I think, was the expose going on the West Coast of his Western Goals Foundation that he headed up. And because they had been involved through clandestine operations of the LAPD and the Red Squad of the LAPD and this police intelligence unit there, they had gotten hold of all the police spying reports on all dissident and left activities, civil rights, the anti-war movement, all through the 60s and 70s have been computerized, and the LAPD was the central point all these things were brought to through the funding of the Law Enforcement Intelligence Unit, LEIU funds, and they had this huge computer there that was a central database, and the information from that computer was stolen by this detective, J. Paul, given to his wife, Mary Love, who had access to a $100,000 computer system in Long Beach, which belonged to Western Goals. And the ACLU was suing both the LAPD and Western Goals. A $2 million settlement was paid in that suit. And that suit was coming to the point that it was going to identify McDonald and flesh him out into the limelight, and that this would have gone further McDonald and possibly compromised, the Reagan campaign also was heating up at that point, and could have caused trouble. And it was right at that point that William French Smith stepped down, if you remember, from the Justice Department, and Ed Meese, an old compatriot of Reagan's, came in. And William French Smith worked for the law firm that was was carrying the case for the LAPD.
Well, and Reagan's old friend, the judge that was his national security advisor, quit right away. He went and worked for the Commerce Department for a few weeks.
Yes.
Went back to Washington. Went back to California.
There were tremendous sort of musical chairs as soon as 07 went. One woman called me and told me to look for a book written 2 years before the incident called Flight 209 is Down, written by a guy named Barry Schiff, who apparently writes for aviation magazines. and is well known in the field. This is a novelization, and in this novel he tells a story of a stealth manufacturer, a commercial stealth manufacturer, who's trying to get a bid to have his stealth plane be the contract plane for the military. He's afraid that the competitive company is going to get it. She said the description of the company, was very close to Boeing, which in fact, as far as I understand, built the 007 plane. Isn't that a Boeing?
Oh yeah, 747
unit? Okay, and she said that the person in this book much resembled there was a congressman on the board of this Boeing like company in the novel who much resembled Scoop Jackson. And the scenario was that fearing that their stealth plane wouldn't get chosen, they staged a scenario taking a regular commercial flight near to Soviet airspace and then taking a stealth plane into the actual Soviet airspace to test it out and show that it couldn't be touched, and lit up the Soviet defense systems and all that, and then kicked out on the other side. But in this novel, the congressman takes a present from the director of this company, which is an explosion inside of a champagne bottle, packs it in his luggage, and his commercial flight is then blown out of the air and lands on an ice floe and finally gets back to civilization. But by then, it's too late. They've voted the other way, the stealth planes, and he can't get anybody to listen to him. So this 2 years ahead, the scenario is written out in this novel. And in real life, the day of the 007 crash, Scoop Jackson, who resembles the character of this congressman who's set up in the novel, died of a heart attack. Now, Scoop Jackson was sitting on the board of Boeing, and he was replaced there by Alexander Haig. And he was sitting on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and he was replaced there by Kissinger. And Pipes, another person central to that team, moved into the National Security Council at that point. And when McDonald disappeared, Western Goals was then headed up by Spitz Channel, who had been the main fundraiser for the national the NED, the democracy unit that was a funding thing for Oliver North, and it helped with Oliver North's Contra funding. So a lot of people around Kissinger and around North seemed to switch over that day. North also, shortly after he came into his position in the NSC, National Security Council, was given responsibility for the geopolitical positioning of satellites, spy satellites all around the world. And so he would have been in a position to have a satellite in place to watch 007. And in fact, the main geopolitical satellite, by my understanding, what I've read, was looping over the R-20 route in the same direction that it would have been going. So when the Soviets, about to test the ICBM missile, and with their defenses up, lit up their whole defense system, that got a look at it. The shuttle Challenger on a military mission was also making a similar orbit along the same route and would have been in a position to watch this. So often these operations, I think, have many, many levels and purposes in terms of shifting people and carrying out policy and spying, and all these things can be bundled up, and getting the propaganda value. To the extent that I wonder whether any covert operation is ever done for a single purpose, or whether they wait, in a sense, or plan in such a way that it has to have multiple bonus before it's done.
Well, I don't think there's much question in this one. In addition to all the things you cite, because they're all factors, but the one that is really important is that about 3 days later, the largest defense budget ever passed almost without a vote.
Yes.
Just boom, passed. Well, that's because Schultz and Reagan are out there screaming, evil empire.
Yes.
And something to show the nature of even that as an impact upon how things are run. There is an organization called USTEC. Are you familiar with that? It's called the USSR Trade and Economic Council. It started under Nixon in 1972, and in October of 1983, the biggest trade agricultural show ever held in the world was scheduled to be held in Moscow. The membership of USTEC, which was not a secret organization, but they were so quiet they might have been secret because nobody knew the membership, was mostly the Fortune 500 CEOs, not a delegated man, but a CEO. It was a big movement, and it met twice a year, once in New York. It had regular offices in New York and regular offices in Moscow. And one year they would meet in New York, and another 6 months they would meet in Moscow. And in the process, they developed programs which, in a speech delivered by Roy Ash, said that the U.S. and the Soviet Union will come together in the middle of 1990. Well, that speech was made in 1972, and it's printed in government books. I've got a copy of the government book in which that's printed. Well, you recapitulate those back through history, and you see how they meet back at this time when even though Reagan was screaming about the evil empire, the Fortune 500 men all went to Moscow 2 weeks later to the Trade and Agriculture Show. Their names are on the list. I have a book, a magazine that they printed with their names having attended there. You can see the president going this direction, the Congress voting the most budget, the evil empire being screamed about all over the world, and all these big businessmen traveling to Moscow for a business show in Moscow. It didn't bother. That's all stage show, you see? And this is the way it has to be looked at. I don't know, like you know secret operations about as well as anybody I know, but you've just told me you never heard of USTEC. USTEC probably was the most powerful organization in the world from 1972 until today, because today it's ridiculous, see? But today, those same business, you know who's the head of the group? Dwayne Andreas. You've heard that name.
Yes.
And people like that.
Okay.
And that same group today are the ones that are dissecting the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Cashing
You see?
in.
That's how these things get to be so important. And they didn't care about 007, except that it did the defense budget. Otherwise, they still packed their bags and went to Moscow.
Well, I wanted to end with one more question, which relates to the movie itself, JFK, and the work that you did on how John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And I know that you looked at that in great detail, both at the mechanic level and beyond, at the cover-up. And as you ask in the movie, the real question is why the person assassinated, who benefits, who's in a position to cover it up. Did you see similarities in terms of personnel, mechanics, money, weapons used, ballistics, and cover-up in other instances where there were murders or attempted murders on political candidates or presidential people since the time of John F. Kennedy?
Well, one of the basic rules whenever there's an assassination or in the mafia business, a rub-out or something, one of the basic rules is to have it occur at a time when the normal protection isn't there. If a mafia chief, wherever he goes, has his strong arm bodyguard with him, then he's safe. But leave him behind and he can be got. Well, although I was miles away from Dallas and current newspapers, the minute I saw that New Zealand newspaper with a picture of the Texas School Book building, and I saw the open windows, I turned to the congressman that had been traveling with me, and I said, Pete, something is wrong in Dallas because the Secret Service would not have open windows overlooking the place where the president's going to be. I mean, they could have hit him with a flower pot. The windows were open, and you've seen those pictures many times. Okay, that's the first thing, that worried me. The next thing was, and of course, I didn't have access to a radio. We were at the Navy base. I didn't have a TV to turn to, and we were getting ready to take off and back to the States anyway, so I couldn't do any research down there. I just had that idea, something's wrong. Well, in a sub-headline in that same paper, it said very clearly, 3 bursts of automatic weapon fire were heard killing the president. 3 bursts of automatic weapon fire. Now, I found out later when I got back to the States that when CBS and the other broadcasters interrupted their programs quickly at that time of the day, the first thing they said was, the president had been shot in Dallas, 3 bursts of automatic weapon fire. You've never seen that in print other than at that first moment, the first issue of the paper, or the first CD. They didn't want anybody to think there were 3 bursts of automatic weapon fire. It never appeared, but it's in print, you see. And people who remember the TV program, or even the few that have recorded it, I got a copy of a recording from London, refer to the 3 bursts of weapon fire. So these are things you look for when there's an assassination. And the other part of it, since I myself had participated in such activities, I went to Mexico City with an advance group to arrange for the protection of President Eisenhower's visit in Mexico City. And you know, it's like swimming in the ocean. Once you've been in the ocean, you don't have to go all over the world and see what the ocean's like. You know what it is. Well, once I had been to Mexico City with these leaders of protection work, military and Secret Service, and anybody else they need, they have the power to get anybody they need. I had seen them first look at all the buildings, checking the window problems, look at the roofs of the building, where to put a man on the roof, where to put a sniper, where to put a man with radio, to control every move that the president made. Because, of course, the Secret Service knows that at such and such a minute he's going to be at this place, and at such a minute at that place, and those are the places that had to be protected. That's a business. They've been doing it for 100 years. And when I came back to the States, and carefully, my work was in the Pentagon, in the JCS area, and I looked at everything I could find in the Pentagon. They clip newspapers, and every morning you get the big clips. Yes. And so everything was there in the clips that were on my desk when I came back. And I found all these things that had not been done. I had to feel there was something terribly wrong, because poor little old Oswald couldn't have had the phone and say, hey fellas, don't come to Dallas, we don't need you today, or don't do this, or it won't make any difference if nobody on the roof, or, you know. It had to have been done as part of a negative plan to open the president up to that kind of an operation. Yes. Then, through the work that I had been in all those years, I knew something that I don't like to talk about too often. We maintain what's called a murder incorporated. We maintain mechanics, killers. They're not in the United States. Now, you probably recall that Lyndon Johnson said to Leo Janus in an article that appeared in Atlantic Monthly in July of 1973, he said, I have never believed that Oswald did it alone. I know there was a conspiracy, and we maintained a damn murder incorporated. Now, for the President of the United States to say that after the Warren Commission report, everybody ought to take their copy of the Warren Commission, throw it out the window, and just keep those 3 lines, and he's got the answer. And I know that we do have mechanics, hitmen. But they always have to work behind the cover story. They always have to have patsies and all, because these men are international, and they don't live here. They're trained. They aren't even all Americans. They're whatever we need for the job. And when the job is done, the man is dead, they're gone. Nope, we're like the tramps being marched through Dealey Plaza. While those tramps are being marched, that covers up, it gets all the photographers out there, and the real men just disappear down the sewer pipes and other things. Their route. And like they think about, well, if there was a man on a grassy knoll, what did he do with his gun? Well, if the man on grassy knoll was there, you can be sure that somebody had drilled a hole, like, say, to put up a fence post, and the gun was long gone down that, and all he had to do was kick a little cover and it was gone. You know, they plan these things for weeks ahead of time, and it was done cleanly that way. We will never find out who did it. We see the cover story every day. People are doing that. And we could find that out. We could, but there's no prosecutor, because when this happened, also there was a coup d'etat. And in a coup d'etat, you have no prosecutors. There has never been a trial in the state of Texas. By law, there must be a murder trial in the state where a murder takes place. You don't have to have Lee Harvey Oswald alive, because he wasn't guilty. He was only allegedly guilty, and even that was pretty thin. You can bring John Doe in and try him for the murder and go all through the grand jury process and listen to all the witnesses and the pro and the con, and end up by saying John Doe wasn't guilty, and that's a trial. But the state of Texas was told, Waggoner Carr was told by Lyndon Johnson, don't fool with this, I'm having the Chief Justice set up a commission to investigate. Well, a commission to investigate is part of the crime. That isn't how our laws run. You don't investigate murders, well, the police do, but you try murders in a court. Yes. And to me, that overhang, the fact that all these years later, there's never been a trial in Texas, just proves that the system that brought about the death of the president is so high up and still exists. You can't even question those facts.
Did you feel that something similar happened in the murder of Bobby Kennedy, or?
Oh yes, almost exactly. Mm-hmm. The same kind of precision with the cover-up. I'll tell you something that I have never written in my writing on these subjects, because it closely involves other people, but I think I can avoid them. I was traveling in a foreign country, and a friend of mine who was, just to mention his status, a vice president of American Express Company, knew me pretty well, And he said, come here, I want you to meet somebody. So we were at a cocktail party for the event that I had traveled to be there for. It had to do with the banking minister. And he introduced me to a lady, and he said this lady was one of the Kennedy girls, Bobby Kennedy. When Bobby Kennedy was running in California, his PR people had arranged for him to have a black girl, a Spanish girl, an Asian, and an American girl. So everywhere he went, they were in the same dresses, same little white hat like Jackie Kennedy used to wear, and they went everywhere he went. Well, this was one of those girls. She told me that when they came off the stage after Bobby Kennedy had made his speech in the Ambassador Hotel, they had already been told to be at this door, and they would go out to their cars, and then realized that Bobby Kennedy was being run through the kitchen door and taken out that way. So the 4 girls raced across the ballroom, and a lot of people in the way, and they got there, and she said, I came there in that narrow doorway just as Bobby had sort of stepped back, and said, I bumped him from the back. I was close to him. And she said a hand was on my shoulder, and a gun went off in my ear, and I saw Bobby's head blow up right in front of me. And you know, the fatal shot was behind his right ear. She was there. Some cameraman, she thinks, in the excitement, knocked her to the floor. She was laying on the floor. In fact, there are pictures of Bobby laying in his last few breaths on the floor with his head on a little white, it's her hat that was on the floor. Somebody picked her up and ran her up into the hotel and said, for your safety, you'll have to come with me and stay here. There are terrible riots downstairs. She spent the night in that hotel, and for some reason, in 2 or 3 rooms. They moved her. I think they were afraid her family would finally find out where she was last seen. But anyway, when she came down in the morning to leave, her husband was there with her child and packed bags. They were taken to Detroit. The next morning, he started working for General Motors Company. And they stayed there a year. They never dared to talk to anybody. And in the year, they planned what they were going to do with the rest of their lives. They went to this other country where they've been, and I guess are there. But now that is first-hand information. There was no reason for it to be other than true from my point of view, because it didn't mean a darn thing to me or to her. In fact, she was rather hesitant in speaking about it. And it corroborates so many of the things we've heard that happened in that scuffle out there. And the fact that Sirhan was spraying bullets around, whereas this one bullet went bang. And she had ear trouble ever since then. From that, she had doctor's records of her ear trouble and so on. I think that it was the same kind of a deal. A very well-trained, efficient hitman moved in at the right point and moved away quickly. And of course, being part of the system, the police wouldn't touch him, so he escapes, and the thing is taken over. Now, that's just things that I happen to have been through. I'm not a researcher about how many bullets went into the ceiling and how many went there. I noticed the things that seem to have been done, like if I were running the assassination, because I have, unfortunately, I have to say, I have been supporting such things in foreign countries. And you watch every detail or it doesn't work. And that was a very clean operation.
I noticed.
Again, it goes back to the trial. Even the Sirhan trial was a travesty.
Yes.
You know, he just tried. It was just a travesty. They couldn't prove anything in that trial. But anyway.
Well, in my experience, when they have the trials of these planted assassins, it's not like a trial where you would have a defense lawyer go up and take each point and tear it apart. The defense lawyers stipulate to your guilt. They stipulate that you own the gun. They stipulate that you fired the gun. They stipulate that the bullets hit the person without a ballistic test or question. Exactly. And Grant Cooper, the attorney for Sirhan, did exactly the same thing. I mean, you might as well hire a defense lawyer to stipulate you into prison. You know, they don't do a defense, and they don't bring in other testimony.
That's the biggest part of this series of assassination attempts or assassinations is, after all, if there's a murder, it should get a good, honest murder trial, as you would if you found a body laying here on the grass right now.
Yes.
The District of Columbia would pretty soon be trying the murder case, whether they had the fugitive or not. They'd get him, but they'll try the case. It's very important to see it that way, because it moves away from all of the smoke screen, the things that aren't true. Like in the Oswald case, is the classic example of that. And people believe it. It's just astounding. You could not get, I'll bet you 500 of us walked into the editorial offices of any major paper in this country and said, look, gentlemen, print just these words. Oswald did not do it. Not a single newspaper in this country would do it. Maybe if 500,000 of us went, they wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Why?
And that's with a great deal of public understanding.
Yeah,
I found that, I did research into the John and Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, many different murders, the Wallace shooting. And it wasn't because I was necessarily close friends or political supporters of those people, but because I understand that there's a significance when you have the president of a country shot or attempted to shoot it. Something's happening, because as you say, if security is done right, lone nuts can't have any effect on the situation. So if something comes close to or actually has an effect, then security has to be compromised. There has to be some other level, and it has to be looked at.
The first thing I talked to with Oliver Stone, and I must tell you, I never knew Oliver Stone. I'm not a moviegoer before he called me, and so I met him as another very pleasant person, and I enjoyed working with him. But one of the first things I told him was, Oliver, I don't know the details, and I never read the Warren Report, but I have a pretty good idea why the president was killed. And if we can't say to the American public that we're going to find out why he was killed, there's no sense in making the movie. They don't want to hear all about the Garrison trial again, or what went on at Dallas, or some other thing over here. It's why was Kennedy killed? Because that could happen again tomorrow.
Yeah. I noticed in my work I've done some things to look at other situations that most of the assassination researchers haven't, and one of those is the Reagan shooting. And I noticed a similar pattern of withdrawal of security and ballistic problems and other things.
I'm just going to change the tape, and we'll start up with the...
Okay, sure. And a modern attempt at a president, and that's the shooting on March 31, 1981 of Ronald Reagan. And I noticed a number of things that we've been talking about were present in that situation. So I thought you've done a little bit of work on this. Maybe you could talk about what you saw in that situation.
Well, again, I'll go back to basics. As I learned the business, that if you're going to take a president out of a hotel in the center of the city, and you want to do it secretly, so you bring him through a side door that is sort of a tunnel in the building, and you come out to this little sidewalk, you should be able to get him across that sidewalk and in on a car and away without anybody noticing him, especially if you put a couple of Secret Service men there ahead of time. They know when you're coming through the door, they're ready for it. But here's this, they use the secret door, but they've put a long red velvet cord down the side of the street. They've got the whole presidential motorcade of cars lined up there. There's cameramen right across the way lined up there. So obviously, the way it is in Washington, anytime you see cameras grinding away and a big long red cord by the edge of the street, you know that very quickly some dignitary is going to come through the door. You can't tell. And it's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous to think that they went to the trouble of going through that door and then did that kind of display to sort of draw a crowd, which of course would hide Hinckley or anybody else involved. The other thing is that door is right under the windows of a building across a rather narrow street that are the Hilton Hotel headquarters. I mean, their office staff and everything.
It's the Universal building.
Yes, they could have gone to the Hilton people and said, we want to go up here, and then they would have everything under control right down there. If they saw a man even reach for his handkerchief, they could figure he's a target. Watch him. And none of that was done. And in fact, the pictures that were taken, some of which are quite amazing, alert you to the fact that the Secret Service men seem to have had different orders. Now, there was a picture released, and it says in the magazine I saw it in, which is the magazine editor and publisher, if anybody wants to look it up, released by the White House. And in this picture, unbelievably, the people on protection duty, the police and the Secret Service, are looking at Reagan. Now, if I'm in the defensive line of a football team on the offense side, and the quarterback has got the ball to throw a pass, are my linemen going to turn and watch the quarterback, or are they going to watch the men rushing through the line? Why are people working to save the president watching the president? And to me, I've written the story, and I say, look at those eyes, and there's the answer to the question. Something unusual had been told to those men, and not, let's save the president. See, well, when you see that kind of an indicator, then everything else begins to fall down. And when the Secret Service man, Mr. Parr, who pushed the president in the door because he heard 6 shots in 2 seconds. Now, he has written an article about that, and I have a copy of that article, that there were 6 shots in 2 seconds. That's pretty dang good. That's almost as good as Oswald with 3 shots in 6 seconds. And he gets in, pushes him in, and Reagan fell over the hump on the floor of the car, and he fell on top of Reagan, and another Secret Service man pushed their feet in and slammed the door. Then they got themselves untangled, yelled at the driver and said, go to the White House. So they're heading for the White House. Nobody's injured, no problem. So they untangle themselves from the floor of the car, get up in the seat, and they're going down Connecticut Avenue, back to the White House. And Reagan turns to Parr. He said, you know, I'm having trouble breathing. And then he said, I might have cut my lip. Parr yells at the driver. He said, we got an injury, go to the hospital. So they turn then and go to the hospital. When they got to the hospital, an absolutely unbelievable sequence happens. The nurse inside, one of the nurses, saw this big limousine pull up. And right away, she said, we've got a problem here. And the people began to assemble. And Reagan got out and sort of joking and walking, starts going into the hospital. And then he began to go down, and he's like, I'm having trouble breathing. So they helped him. They put him on a bed and started working as if he had a heart attack. It was 12 minutes before anybody told the people in the hospital that there was a bullet wound. They didn't know he had been brought there for a bullet wound. Nobody mentioned the bullet wound. And yet Parr, writing about this story many years later, said, of the 6 bullets, 1 hit the back window. He said, I saw the hole in the window. Well, what did he think caused the trouble? He knew there were bullets being fired. And by that time, the other cars had come with the other wounded men, and those men were all getting treatment in the emergency rooms there for bullet wounds, and yet the president was just being worked on. They were checking his blood pressure as though he had a heart attack. He said he had trouble breathing. Finally, when they were checking under his arm to attach the cuff to get his blood pressure, they saw a slit under his arm. And the x-ray of the slit revealed what the doctor first said looked like a comma, a little thing in there that looked about like a comma. And he said, what kind of a gun was used? And they turned to the Secret Service man. He said, well, I wouldn't know. They said, well, the FBI has the gun. So immediately, one of the Secret Service men, no, a man from the hospital, called the FBI, and he said, what kind of a gun was used? And after quite a discussion, he turned to the Secret Service man and he said, they won't tell me. I said, well, you tell them they've got to. We're working on the president. So there was some conversation about you have to tell them and all that. Finally, the FBI said it was a .38. So that was, they found out what the bullet was. They wanted to know the size of it, of course, for if they only saw that little fragment, there must be other fragments. Well, as it went on, about that time, among the staff in the hospital, they heard somebody else say that we've taken a .22 bullet out of this other man, one of the other men that was injured. And then they repeated that again when they got a .22 out of the other person. And they're saying, well, Parr here says it was only one gun. This guy fired 6 shots in 2 seconds. There must be a .22. So they finally worked this bullet out of Reagan's chest near his lung. It was in his lung, worked it out, and they recovered this little piece, and it had all the definitions of a .22, plus the fact that it had ricocheted, and it had a bit of the paint of the car, so that when it hit the edge of the car and the door was open, it went through the door jamb just enough to hit Reagan. But of course, then it wasn't hitting at its top velocity, it just went in there. But all that foolishness in the hospital, not the fault of the hospital, but nobody saying what the problem was, exacerbated the problem to them thinking that they didn't know what the hell they were trying to get the president to Rico, why they brought him there in the first place. So he stayed there about another 2 weeks while they put him through all kinds of tests. The wounds wasn't so bad, and finally he went back. But when that kind of unusual circumstances happen, everything from the men looking somewhere else instead of into the crowd, nobody protecting him from the upper buildings, bringing him out through that door, again, we have this pattern of stranger than normal events that raises an awful lot of questioning.
I went
to deny it.
I went into great detail looking in the medical journals, looking at all the footage of the interviews with the press at the hospital, looking over and over again hundreds of times at the in both full and slow motion at the footage of the shooting itself. What you're talking about, this VIP entrance, I think is very important because this is a place that's set up for the speakers, the very important people, to come in and out of quickly. When they finish speaking in the ballroom, it's possible to exit down a short hallway, get into an elevator and go up one floor, go down another hallway, and you're outside. One of the advantages of this for security is that you have the crowd by half a mile. I mean, there's no way anybody could get out of the lecture in time to come around and see you leaving. And so it's used that way. And as you say, when security is being done correctly, a car drives up in the same way as if you ordered a limousine to come to your house. It wouldn't park down the block. It would come to your driveway. Well, with the president, I've seen instances in print where they will reposition the limousine 6 inches to get it exactly in line with where they want it to be.
Well, and they know the split second he's coming out the door.
That's right. They know ahead because they're on radio contact.
That second, they're talking on the radio live.
That's right. They're not going to miss him.
It could be a meet just like that.
Yes. And that's what happened when they brought him. They brought him directly to the door. They opened the doors. The Secret Service got out first. They formed 2 lines on either side, and he walked through. Yeah. When he comes out that door to exit, the car is at least 40 to 50 feet away.
They hadn't brought it up.
If you notice, he's walking down that hillside toward the crowd. And in addition to that, the Secret Service, if you watch the film closely, don't surround him to protect him. Only McCarthy goes ahead to the back car door. All the rest go off to his right, like a line of ducks, as if they knew to get out of the line of fire or were told to do something else. Yes, and looking at him, as you point out. They're looking at him probably because they want to see which direction the bullets are going to come from so they can duck correctly. But obviously something wrong is going on. Also, Reagan, the timing of the point at which Reagan is hit became a matter of dispute for the official story that you talk about, because the official story is that he got hit after Parr pushed him into the car by this ricocheting bullet. But if you go back and look at Time magazine and all of the photographs, the front page of the newsletter, and they say Reagan is hit, it's at a point when someone calls out, "Mr. President," I think it's Max Robinson from ABC, and he turns and lifts his arm, and at that point he looks like Connolly in the Dallas situation. His cheeks puff out because one of his lungs is collapsing. You have the edema puffing the cheeks. His mouth is down like this. His shoulders slump. He's clearly hit, and the press saw it and said, "There, Reagan is hit." But the official story couldn't go with that because that's almost simultaneous with Brady being hit by Hinckley's gun. Okay,
well,
so...
John, they treated the picture. If you take that picture that appeared on the cover of Newsweek or Life, anyway, if you treat the one with his arm up,
yes.
And they puffed up everything here. There is an original that in another place, and his lips look perfectly normal.
Well, that's interesting.
The same picture, exactly the same picture.
Because in all the original reports, he appears to be hit at an earlier point. Yeah. The other thing that made me discount the ricocheting bullet thesis was that when I looked in great detail at the still photographs of the car, you can see that window hole in the back window of the car. Mm-hmm. The bullet is hit there. It's bulletproof, so it just makes a small shatter. But and then behind there is a hole going into the trunk. It doesn't look like a little scratch that a bullet has made ricocheting. It's an open hole, and I've seen close-up photographs of it going into the trunk of the car. Now, you've only got 6 bullets. At least one hits Brady. At least one nicks Delahanty and stays in his neck, throws him to the ground. One lifts McCarthy up into the air to the front of the car. A 4th bullet hits the Universal building across the street. The 5th goes into the window of the car. And the last one, I say, goes into the trunk. It doesn't do the ricochet. Yeah. They describe them later as these 22 shells that they've taken from Reagan, but all of that is based on the FBI study. And when I went through the court transcripts here, I found, by going into exacting detail, that the story of how the bullets and the ballistic work was done is that a box of bullets marked Reagan shooting were left on a desk.
Everybody's bullets, all of them.
Well, just Reagan shooting. This is... And it's
but not just the one in Reagan.
Well, presumably these are the bullets taken from Reagan, but these are the 22s. Yeah. But they're left on a desk of an FBI ballistics man who's down in the lab. 8 hours later, he comes up and finds this box on his desk, and those become the official bullets. They don't seem to include this bullet from the medical journals is described, the thing they took out of his lung is described by the doctor at the time as round and flat and thin as a dime.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, and not having characteristics apparently of a .22, but just this very thin little disc that they then drop into a cup, but doesn't look like, I've seen the photographs of the thing with the paint on it and some of the gross characteristics of a .22. What he's describing doesn't match that. And so I've been very suspicious of the official story, even of the story that they went down Connecticut Avenue and then went to the hospital. And that's because of several things. But in the book, if you read it closely, they call in, they say there's trouble to the White House, and they say Rawhide is okay, which is the code name for Reagan, meaning he's not dead. The others are on the ground. Rawhide is okay. And then they say we're going to and they put a code word, it says code word, that means White House. They put in parentheses White House. They don't give you the code word. And then the book says we went up T Street, which runs along Hilton there, to Connecticut. It said, and we went to the right. We're making a right on Connecticut. Well, if you make a right on Connecticut, you're not going to the White House, are you?
You can't do that.
I think where you're going is up to Bethesda. The other thing that I noticed was a great confusion, you may remember, right at the beginning, where they said that Reagan is shot or he's not shot, Brady's shot or he's not shot, one or the other is dead or not. There was just tremendous confusion back and forth. The reports were totally contradictory. Different reports from the White House, from the press, from the scene, from the hospital. And I was wondering, are they just buying time? Are they is the president already dead? There was also the report, if you remember, first that the president came in on a stretcher.
Yeah.
And then the report that he walked in on his own. Do you remember these two? Well, I went to the footage and I looked and looked and looked, and I finally got the footage like right at the time, and the interviews at the time. And they're interviewing first a black man out on the street who was in the emergency room before any of this matter arrived. And he said that two men came in, identified themselves as Secret Service, cursed at people, and told them to get the hell out of the room, and cleared the whole room. And one of the people who was there, according to the Washington Post, was the director of the Selective Service, who said he happened to be visiting a relative at the hospital and came down in the emergency room. So the emergency room is cleared before, presumably, anything's happened, as if they've got radio contact that something's coming. Then this guy describes what happened next. Was an ambulance arrives, and they take a guy out on a stretcher, surrounded by Secret Service, and they run him in, okay? Then 15 minutes later, because I can see the clock running on these little pictures, is the sequence where Reagan is going in and arriving at the hospital. 15 minutes after this sequence with the guy on the stretcher. So I looked at it further and further, and I found out the guy on the stretcher is Brady.
Yeah.
Well, Brady, at the time that Reagan took off in the limousine, is lying on the ground still.
Still there.
It took 3 to 5 minutes, by reports, to even get an ambulance over to where they could get him in and get him down to the hospital. So Brady arriving, with that delay, and still 15 minutes later means that Reagan was somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because if you knew that there was were bullets at the scene you wanted to go to the hospital, you'd come up to Connecticut and you'd go on to Florida Avenue, and you'd take Florida to 21st, and you'd be right down to the circle into the hospital. If you did what they said, which is to turn left and head for the White House, and then discover, as they said, they noticed this coming under the tunnel below DuPont Circle, that he was coughing blood, you would turn right on M Street and go over to 21st, and you're in the circle. The route that they describe in the paper, and I'm sure this is covered for where Reagan was and how it took so much time, is that they went all the way down Connecticut to Pennsylvania in front of the White House, turned right on Pennsylvania, came back up, like taking the other two sides of a triangle to get to the point when, if the president's in trouble, you had to the quickest way possible to the nearest hospital. So there's no excuse for the delay. And then it came out in the news that night, because they had a big press conference, and they talked about the angle of the bullet. And this is another thing that, to me, belies the ricochet shot. The angle of the bullet, according to O'Donnell, a doctor, was a 45-degree downward angle. It was back to front, and it was left to right. This puts it in exactly the opposite relation as Hinckley further down the way, and it seems to me that it came from above on the retaining wall downward into Reagan's arm when he lifted it. If you know anything about police work or protection, you know that they train police, even if they have a vest on, if they're going to fire their weapon, not to bring their arms up beyond a certain point. Because once they lift their arms, even with a vest on, a good assassin can get them through the armpit to the heart. And so when he raises his arm, he's in the vulnerable position. Now, I found out also that the Secret Service told him there was no security trouble and he didn't need to wear his vest that day. I'm sure he wore it the rest of the administration, but they told him to leave it off that day. And so he's out there without a vest, but just in case, they wait till he raises his arm, and that's a good way to hit him, and hit him with something that leaves, as you say, a little slit. The nurses all thought he was having a heart attack. Nobody mentioned a bullet, and they find this razor slit in the arm.
I can't find any mechanical way to describe that a 22 bullet, we'll say it's 22, can ricochet and look like a dime. How could you make something circular, you know, out of...
Exactly.
It wouldn't work because it's got a front and a back so that one end would be bigger than the other.
Yes.
You know, that kind of... I've been in the military and I've fired thousands. I used to teach gunnery on a range, and I've fired thousands. And you can't fire bullets at a straw of hay without deforming the bullet, you know.
Yeah.
But how could it come up looking like a dime? I know it could come up as thin as a dime, you know, part of it, that sort of thing, but not... They describe it as
round, flat, thin as a dime. Those are the words.
There's so much, and your discussion of the route between the hotel and the hospital, we both know the route very well. None of us would have driven that way, and Secret Service drivers are supposed to know better than that.
Well, I think Reagan was somewhere else. I think he was being taken to Bethesda, and there was a huge argument in the operations room of the White House, and I think a decision was made to leave him alive and bring him back down, because I think if he'd been to Bethesda, he would have gotten the same treatment that John Kennedy did when he got there. They would have murdered him and then no autopsy, I mean, you know, similar to Kennedy, and finished the job. But what amazed me was that after O'Donnell had the press conference, ABC anchor, national anchor, comes back on interviewing the head of the trauma unit at GW Hospital, and he says, I understand that there were people who wanted to move President Reagan after he came into the trauma room and take him to Bethesda Hospital. This is on the national news. And the guy and the director says, no one comes into my trauma room, President of the United States or not, is going to get moved out of there until I'm sure that they're okay. And that guy, unbeknownst to him, I think, saved Reagan's life by not allowing him to move. But he said that the Secret Service were pressing him until 6 the next morning to take Reagan out and put him up at Bethesda. And the response of the ABC anchor to that story was, he said, and I told him he's not moving. And the ABC anchor responds by saying, no matter how much the Navy yells, this is on national television.
Really?
What has the Navy got to yell about? And he responded back, yes, no matter how much the Navy yells. Well, why did the Navy and the Secret Service want Reagan at Bethesda instead of at GWU? They've already got the piece of metal out of him, although they almost closed him up without it. It was so small, they could see on the x-ray, but they couldn't get at it, which also speaks to how flat it was. And all the wounds of the other people, despite the story about, you know, that the others took a 28 out of somebody, to me don't seem to correlate to a 28 pistol.
No,
or a 22, I mean.
22's out.
Yes, but I'm saying the damage done doesn't seem to correlate.
No,
Brady has excessive brain damage. McCarthy's lifted off the ground. He's 160 pounds. Yes, thrown back to the other end of the car.
Oswald flying through the air when movie shot. Oswald just went... You know,
yes, because that kind of a gun isn't going to do that damage. And the FBI said at the beginning that the gun was a 38. And that was on the news that it was a 38, and only later a 22. And I've watched the films in great detail, and I believe I can show you in that film where the 38 is picked up by a Secret Service agent and pocketed and disappears, and also where the 22 is planted, apparently by a D.C. cop, but a 22 suddenly appears on the scene at this guy's feet when he's jostling around with the crowd. So I think, and then the other thing that keyed me that something was wrong, beyond all that, was that Hinckley, who is in D.C., he's arrested for perhaps a federal crime, but still a D.C. area crime, is put under military custody. Hinckley was taken to Quantico Marine Corps Base, and then after that he was taken to Butner, South Carolina, which was a prison built specifically for mind control operations and psychological operations. And that's where they do the debriefing to try to determine whether he's sane or not. So they have all those months to make sure that he's not going to say anything wrong, and maybe convince him, yes, you hit the president, so he won't argue. And again, we go into court, we have a mini trial, and the defense, which was the law firm of William Bennett, of all people to turn to defend you, with excessive connections with the CIA and other things. Bennett's firm comes in and defends Hinckley, but says, we stipulate the weapon, we stipulate the ballistics, and everything is settled. But then in that case, they get a reading of guilt, not guilty by reason of insanity.
Did you ever read that one of the men with the ABC camera crew was Kevin O'Donnell,
No,
Kenny's son?
really.
How come they happened
JFK's
to
friend.
get him right there just to make sure you could see what was going on?
I guess they're afraid the family won't get the message. I think it came out in, wasn't it in Tip O'Neill's book that O'Donnell had told him that they thought there was somebody up on the knoll, or they had thought that Oswald hadn't do it, and it was years later. But I think Kenny O'Donnell is the one that he says that about.
20 minutes after it happened, I was working in town in my office. I got a call from Kevin. He said, you should see what just happened. So I met with him a little later.
Well, I also thought it was very interesting that Hinckley's older brother, Scott Hinckley, was scheduled, and they call it irony in the press, that it was ironic that he was scheduled to have dinner that night with Neil Bush, Bush's son. And if I had told you that on November 22nd, 1963, there was a dinner engagement between Robert Oswald and Linda Bird Johnson, I think you would have gotten the point.
Well, what was it? Bush was in Fort Worth that day, too, wasn't
Yes, he was in, and in fact described, after he heard the news, he wasn't sure whether he would come back. He was described as calm, not concerned about what was happening.
Oh, Haig was taken over.
That's right. Haig came out and said, gentlemen, I am in charge here until the vice president returns. And I have felt that from that day forward, Bush became president of the United States, and Reagan was effectively put in his position.
He you know, he was from Hollywood, and he played a pretty good scene there for a few more years. Well, assassination is a business.
Yes, obviously.
Roughly speaking, it runs the same course. But people must remember that there's two things in assassination. One is to kill the guy, and the other is to have the story ready. Have the story ready first. then it gets successful.
Do you think, given this long history of these sort of operations and skullduggery and illegal and secret maneuvers controlling our lives, that there is a way to reverse this, that there is some way in the society to turn this around, to make it so that we don't live at the whim of the people who want to carry out these operations?
I don't think so. You know, you hate to say it, but it's human nature in a sense. If you're in a position where somebody is bothering you so much that you got to remove him, you know, like Thomas à Becket and Henry II, there'll be people that remove him. That's all. To please the king. They'll see that Thomas à Becket isn't there any longer. No, it's historical, and unfortunately, it's part of us. I don't see how things like that can be changed, simply because we aren't organized that much to be able to look at them ahead of time. And like if I were going to do it, I'd start by taking money away from Congress. Just cut it down so they couldn't pay these guys to buy guns. You know, cut Congress back down, cut the money supply down to where they can just do the jobs they're supposed to do and leave it there. But we know darn well that's never going to happen. There's too much money. I remember in the first of the Kennedy days, this is kind of interesting, in the first of the Kennedy days, I was one of the few hangovers from the earlier regime staying up there because I was in the Office of Special Operations, and I wore a uniform every day, and in came all these new civilians, you know, Yarmolinsky and McNamara and Eindhoven and on and on, the whiz kids, you know. And one of the first days, they were talking about the budget for defense, and it had just reached $50 billion. And we were down in one of the lunchrooms talking about it, and in the group was Ed Katzenbach, the other Katzenbach brother, Nick Katzenbach, was with Kennedy, and Ed Katzenbach, former dean at Princeton, was with McNamara at that time. He committed suicide later. But Ed Katzenbach turned to the people around the table and they said, look, there's an ideal way to handle a $50 billion military budget. We've got 50 states now. Give them all $1 billion and then let's take it easy. He might just as well have done.